Okay, we'll just wait a few minutes until we begin here. Okay, it is 12 o'clock right on the dot, and the silence was kind of deafening. Okay, so hello everybody. We'll get started, I suppose. If anybody joins in as we're going, they probably won't miss much. My name is Mary Elliott. I am the Plant Health Technical Advisor for SARM Division 1, and I will be your host today. Today's topic, as I'm sure you all know, or I hope you do, is weed control and organic agriculture. And talking to us about this subject will be Corey Jacob, the Provincial Weed Specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture. A few housekeeping things. This webinar is eligible for one continuing education credit in pest management, I believe. And at the end of the session, there will be a question period, time permitting, where anybody that has submitted questions in the little question box at the top right hand of your screen can have their questions asked. And this is recorded as well. So it'll be put up on the SARM website in about a week or so-ish if anybody wants to go back and look through it again, or if anybody has missed it. Okay, that's my spiel. I will turn things over to Corey now. Stop sharing. Okay, Corey, you should be good to go now.
Perfect. Thanks, Mary-Eve. I'm just going to put it into presenter mode, and that should be my presentation screen, I'm hoping.
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so thanks very much, Mary-Eve, for the quick little introduction there, and for the participation and attendance this afternoon, everybody, on a beautiful day. I just had a bolt fall out of my chair as I was moving, so I just was looking around, making sure it doesn't give while I'm talking here. So hopefully everything is okay for the little. A short little webinar. And Katie, the PhDs, kind of asked me to touch on for this webinar. So a little bit on the application of the Weed Control Act to organic producers, and then a little bit on organic weed control. So what weed control can organic producers do? So it's going to be kind of divided up into those two topics. So so we'll just get going with the webinar here. So of course, approaching enforcement of the Weed Control Act on organic production systems. A little bit of this is also from the organic industry as well, for some information that I've gotten from there, and a little bit from Clark Brownsville as well, because he was in the role before me, and quite a wealth of knowledge. So we're going to start here with of course, determining organic status, because, of course, if you're dealing with an issue or a complaint, you can determine if that individual is organic or not. So, of course, there is currently a national organic standard that defines organic production. So, what is or was not organic production? This designates the processes in order to call the product that you produce organic. Normally, in grain, that would be the grain that they produce, whether it's organic wheat or et cetera, et cetera. The standard also isn't intended to supersede the Weed Control Act. So the Weed Control Act would still take precedence over their organic standard. And as well, an organic producer must be certified by a recognized third-party certifying agency to be considered organic under the standard. And I believe I'm not sure how many organic third-party certifying agencies we have in the province, but or in the country, but we do have several, I do believe. As well, to determine organic status, you can also, I guess I should also say, organic producers are requested by their certifying agencies to contact the RM they live in to alert them to their presence, primarily to prevent any drift, whether when they're spraying, a roadside or a ditch. Just to be aware, to have a little bit more, I'm going to say, caution, care, and attention. For that, maybe if you're spraying, give the courtesy to your neighbor, or that person in the RM to maybe not spray when the wind is blowing towards their organic certified field. And as well for neighbors, especially if you've got people who are new in the RM coming in with land rentals and that. But this doesn't mean that the RM can't spray beside organic land. We just advise taking that extra care and attention to avoid drifting or causing any damage to that organic producer's crop, or worst case scenario is them losing that certification, because that's a big one that takes some time and effort to get. As well, if you're wondering if they are organic certified, you can ask to see their certification document from their certifying body. Every organic producer must be certified to sell their product or products, depending if they're for organic for livestock or cropland or even vegetable or horticulture production. I do believe anybody producing or selling less than $5,000 would be exempt, but that's a very small farm and production there. As well, if you're dealing with a producer who's maybe transitioning to organic from conventional agriculture, you can also ask to see their paperwork and their application for certification. As I believe it's, when I last checked, it was a 3-year certification, and I don't think that has changed. But I'm not on top of the organic world and the rules and regulations too much there. As well, if you're a weed inspector and you're having some difficulty or getting difficulty or having cooperation issues with an organic producer, one way of maybe working or managing that could be going, if you're having issues managing noxious weeds or nuisance weeds, you can also lodge a complaint with that particular producer certifying body. and in some cases, that complaint must be dealt with before certification of the crop can take place. It could be one other tool in the toolbox to dealing with the situation. The only issue there is likely certain certification bodies will be more diligent and better than others at maybe dealing with these complaints or issues. If we've got multiple ones from multiple or the same person over and over again, or multiple ones, I mean, it could become a bit of an issue. But for one-offs or difficult situations, it might be one other method to look into. I've never dealt with that before, but I'm sure calling the right certification body could maybe that producer has could maybe be a good excuse me, a good pathfinding tool to maybe help remediating a situation. As well, there is a little bit of flexibility for weed inspectors when dealing with an organic producer. So I think the first one there is the Weed Control Act does not say or does not dictate control using herbicides only. Of course, herbicides are a very popular tool that we use, and they're very, it's quick and easy to spray them, and then we can move on to our next job. But there are other methods that we can use to control weeds, whether it's, mowing to hand pulling to a whole other, a very large toolbox here that can be utilized as well. Of course, Clark Brownsville did update the Weed Control Act, and of course, he did that, I think, intentionally to give a lot of latitude to the weed inspector to decide upon which management activity would be best suited to a specific situation. So, of course, the weed inspector is appointed under the RM and is, you know, given their knowledge or their beliefs or given the situation, they can use their best judgment as maybe a herbicide isn't the right plan of action. It could be another method to control the weeds. There are many different cultural ways to manage weeds, especially when you're dealing with nuisance weeds that we have weeds designated as nuisance weeds under the Act, or established populations of noxious weeds. With that being said, enforcement may need to become a little bit more complex with organics. It might not just be as simple as an order, an agreement, or an order to spray. It might be, mowing multiple times or doing something in a cultural method that I'll get into a bit later in the talk to deal with the weeds within reason, of course. But a little bit of a hang-up is, of course, prohibited weeds, because they require, in the Act, they require the use of the most effective method of eradication, and regardless of the land use, and oftentimes that is a herbicide. So prohibited weed, I mean, we don't want any survivors there. If I can review what we kind of talk about with them, is we want scorched earth, we want them eradicated. For the good and the betterment of the industry in the province and your local RM and area, right? They are a very invasive, sometimes dangerous, noxious weed that we don't need, or prohibited weed that we don't need present. So, in that case, eradication is what is needed to be done. So again, if it's a noxious or nuisance weed, flexibility, prohibited weed, it kind of paints you in a corner for dealing with that weed in that situation. Of course, we do have the Weed Control Act. That's the law, right? An organic producer, organic production is not exempt from the Weed Control Act. They still have to abide by and obey those rules, of course. Organic certification does not supersede any federal or any provincial laws. But I do think organic producers, for the most part, would like the opportunity to manage, any noxious or nuisance weeds that they have in their fields without herbicides first. So kind of giving them an opportunity or chance to actively manage the weeds. So, of course, for those producers, it has to be quite proactive and aggressive weed management, because you really need to be on top of your weeds and weed control when you aren't able to use herbicides, which are, of course, is the organic production system. If it's a more of a laissez-faire, I'm just going to wait and see what happens. It's not, that doesn't work for organic. You have to be very much on top of your control, your production, your management. As well, if the weed can't be managed by any other way, and of course we've tried different methods, ways, agreements with the producer, and they're organic, I would say you've given them fair chances and you've got some documented history and situation there. once you feel like you've given more than fair chances and time, and it's hard to be patient sometimes, but then and only then should a herbicide, be used and the organic buffer zone established around that area of the field. So, you know, give them time, give them a chance, be patient, follow up. If they're doing something good, if they're not, then maybe we do have to, as a very last case scenario, move toward a herbicide application. But of course, that has to be our last resort, kind of like an order where we try to have an agreement that can be the way that we can go around managing or navigating a situation. And I do think there's a bit of an opportunity as well for RMs to help in the process. Kind of, it's just more of a philosophical thought. But of course, the RMs can also lead by example. Having very clean properties and rights of ways to kind of set the standard in the RM that we are clean, we do care, we do control our weeds, and I do think it's a bit of a community effort when everybody else sees everyone else controlling their weeds. I do think it's a bit of that the standard is set, and sometimes we do see a lot more care and attention taken to dealing with situations or weed issues that have maybe been neglected for a while. As well, the RM could develop a municipal weed management plan. That could be the weed inspector or one of the employees. Could help establish priorities of that RM that apply to everybody, not just organic producers, because sometimes we can get this, it could also reduce the inclination that maybe the organic producer is being persecuted or targeted when there's weed issues with everyone else. But if you have a written management plan saying this year we're targeting these weeds or this area of the RM, and I think also having written down goals, plans, it's helpful to help track it. We can maybe budget for that. Maybe give the RM the opportunity to move around resources as well with how they're going to maybe manage some a weed management plan in their particular RM or dealing with the situation. I think it's also quite important for communication, and I know a lot of RMs do a good job of this. Communicating priorities to ratepayers. There's obviously different modes and actions that can be taken with that, but that's so we can also have we don't have the excuses coming up, right? So we can't use the excuse that I didn't know, no one told me, I wasn't aware, and also sometimes that past actions come back to bite us, right? So sometimes the lack of enforcement action, but in a certain RM in the past can maybe become the precedent, and that would take a fair bit of time and effort, maybe even making an example of to reverse that. That now we're trying to and of course, it's widespread notification of a change in practice from the past will be needed. Again, nothing to this, to this standard would take, it's just, you just don't flip your fingers and it happens overnight. It does take some time and effort, but it can be turned around and moved. And I know some weed inspectors have done a very good job of turning around some areas that maybe needed some attention or dealing with some challenges as well. But so the main thing there is organic weed control. It's not exempt from the act. I would say to use a little bit more caution and care and attention to try to help remediate the situation before we go to our last resorts. That's basically what I'm trying to say with that portion of the talk. So with that, I think it's also good to touch on weed control options that organic producers can use or utilize, because it's quite actually an interesting production system when you can't use a sprayer, right? Or you can't use a herbicide. You have to think outside of the jug. And I really always look at farmers and their creativity, how they've, to their ingenuity, has solved a lot of issues. And of course, organic weed control is the same idea of how do we make the crop more competitive or control weeds without the use of a herbicide. So I think, number one, and one way that can even be, and I think it's maybe not considered, is sanitation, right? So prevention can be very easy and cheap way of weed control, is to not let that particular weed or weed species become established, or resistant biotype to become established, whether it be on your farm, in a field, in the RM. Of course, sometimes that comes with starting with clean seed. So whether it makes sense or not to purchase certified seed or seed from a neighbor, of course, comes into decisions for cost. But we do hear stories sometimes of producers who bought seed from a neighbor, and they didn't have this weed. Now they've got this weed. Um, Sometimes some weed seeds are very hard to clean out of certain crops due to very similar sizes, or maybe if you're trying to color sort as well from similar colors. So, something to consider. This has when we talk about one problem weed, actually, I'll go to the next um, line here. We also talk about cleaning off or cleaning out seeding equipment, or tillage equipment between fields, right? So if you have issues in one field, just taking a quick blow off of the combine between fields can do a lot to just keep a weed issue in a certain field or part of the field. And actually, custom combiners, I know we have less of them than we did 15, 20 years ago when I was a kid growing up, but they can be notorious, or we're known to sometimes move around weed issues. And that's one of the modes that we think it's been proven actually that Palmer amaranth is a very serious weed in the States, resistant to like 8 or 9 different modes of action, very aggressive, very invasive, moved up from the States to Ontario was through custom combiners 20 some years ago, where they were custom combining. They either cleaned out their combines or didn't do a good enough job, and they brought the weed up there. And that's how it got introduced into Ontario. And of course, they've got many weed issues, but that added to the issue just from a custom combiner coming up. So, small efforts of cleaning can pay off as well. And I've used this term a fair bit, early detection and rapid response. So EDRR, it's kind of a biosecurity buzzword that we use in government, and it's really about detecting a weed or a species or a problem as early as possible and acting on it very quickly. We want to manage it as soon as possible, limit its spread, or even eradicate that weed or that species if possible. So a lot of time when we talk about prohibited weeds, especially some of those, I'm going to say like Palmer amaranth or water hemp or other dangerous weeds, if we can learn about them, we get rid of them with as much effort as we can, especially before they can go to seed. If they go to seed, then we could be dealing with hundreds of plants that might show up this year, next year, 5 years down the road. It becomes more difficult than if we can deal with that small patch or couple of odd plants now. As well, if you're composting manure, they say several weeks with high core temperatures, about 65 to 70 degrees Celsius, to destroy weed seeds as well. And this really doesn't apply to organic producers, but of course, field boundaries where you have maybe crop or seed-line areas and you are spraying herbicide, this is more for a conventional producer. Those areas of the field getting those sublethal doses of chemical can be really bad breeding grounds for or nurseries or breeding grounds for herbicide-resistant weeds. So another just consideration. But we talk about crop rotation, and with organic producers, it's a bit more complex than a wheat canola or wheat canola pulse. But we always say crop rotation should be planned in advance and lengthened out as much as possible or realistic. A mixture of competitive and non-competitive crops. So non-competitive crops would be considered short crops, right? So your lentils, your flax, maybe even a cash crop. If you're an organic producer, I don't know the premium that they would get, but they do, even in conventional farmers, they can pay quite well. Your competitive crops would be your wheat, barley, oats, your canola, any of your crops that establish quite quickly, cover the ground quite well, and grow quite tall so they can shade with and really compete with the weeds for sunlight, for photosynthesis above ground, but also can compete below ground when we're talking about picking up and scavenging for nutrients and roots and a whole other the other nutrients and elements that the plants need to grow and survive. As well, sometimes a producer who's an organic farmer will include periodic forages in the rotation as well, which can be difficult if to pencil out, but hopefully you can make hay off of that, or bales, or have a producer nearby that maybe could buy that and help economically make some money off of that versus a cash crop. And then sometimes as well, maybe a cover crop or an intercrop might be beneficial as well. But I leave that to the producers who are willing to, who do that well, and are willing to learn what that takes to do that. But sometimes in an intercrop, there can be, good complements there for weed control, or just by having different, crops that might be more competitive than others. but to help maybe a less competitive crop grow or whatever have you. This is a bit of older research, but it still is very applicable. So this is some research basically showing how they had a 3-year stand of alfalfa or alfalfa grass hay production. And they basically reduced the density of the weeds quite substantially. So after 3 years of alfalfa or hay grass, they'd reduced the wild oat density by about 95%. Wild mustard here, the red bar, the last year, 60 some percent, maybe 70% reduction. Canada thistle, they did quite well. And cleavers as well. So for some problem weeds, they were really doing really well to empty that seed bank and really bring down the density and the population of the weeds. The only issue there is when we're selecting for a perennial stand, we select for perennial weeds, dandelion being one. And of course, when we're growing annual crops, we select for annual weeds, and then perennial weeds aren't as big of an issue. That's just how it goes in nature with our different cropping systems. So of course, there's several cropping practices that we can do to also make our crop more competitive with weeds. So varying seeding dates for an organic producer, that's more of putting off seeding until you can kind of hit it, maybe try to hit that first flush of weeds. Winter cereals, right? Winter wheat or fall rye, you seed that in the fall. So that can be a really good way to manage weeds or get weeds off balance a little bit. We can also increase our seeding rates, which I'll have some slides on here in a bit, to make the crop more competitive and more thicker, heavier stand. Just less area there for the weeds to grow in. As well, row spacing, right? So if we decrease our row spacing, even if it's 12-inch to 10-inch, I don't know if I mean, because for trash clearance, you can have some issues if you go too narrow, but there's less area there for weeds to grow, and it's occupied by crops as well. So all those little extra tidbits do add up in the long run. And of course, in conventional farming, right, when we have farms growing in size, we've had economic efficiencies or wider row spacings, what have you, take over just to get some crop in the ground very, very quickly as well. So this is some research from John O'Donovan and a few other researchers. They basically here have a graph of the barley seeding rate on the x-axis. Y-axis is the wild oat seed weight. And as they increased the barley yield with the higher barley seeding rate, they also decreased the wild oat yield quite significantly. So again, the higher seeding rate on the crop, it made it more competitive, and it was able to really, really compete with and drive down the weed yield there. So it does work quite well. And as well, crop that's not more competitive with weeds just simply by upping the seeding rate. This is some research done by Steve Shirtliff at the University of Saskatchewan. He essentially doubled the seeding rate from about 130 plants to square meter to 230. And by doing that, he definitely had a higher biomass of the lentils. Of course, less weed biomass as well. And of course, the grain yield went up as well. I don't know what quite the sweet spot would be, but when you're going for plant competition, it did work quite well to reduce the weeds, the weed biomass above ground as well. So it's possible and it can be done just to make the crop more competitive with seeding rate. So this is actually one demo we did. Clark and I had set up about 10 years ago, and I can't believe how quick time flies, but this was done at IHARF, so the Indian Head Agriculture Research Foundation. They have a really cool plot seeder where they can actually adjust the row spacing on the fly. I think it's 8 to 16 inch, where they can adjust it between plots. So we asked Danny and Chris if they would do this demo for us, and they were more than happy to. So we took durum, seeded at half, 1x, 1.5, and 2x your normal seeding rate, and different row spacings from 10, 12, 14, and 16-inch row spacing to really mimic kind of the demo and see what we're talking about here. As well, we cross-seeded canola and wild oats to kind of be pseudo weeds to actually, mimic weeds and weed control and weeds, sorry, not weed control, but weed competition with weeds growing in the field. And we had no herbicide applied, absolutely no herbicide for this to work and be effective. So, it's a stark, you can see quite good and stark differences in the plots, but this is the half of your normal seeding rate at the wide row spacing at 16-inch, and you can see a fair bit of yellow. Well, you can see some yellow in there, right? So some canola, not a very thick stand at half our normal seeding rate and a 16-inch wider row spacing. Leaves us room for weeds to grow and establish and compete with the crop. At a very much higher seeding rate, so on the right here at our 2x seeding rate, 12-inch row spacing, no yellow here, right? A thicker, heavier stand, little narrower row spacing, 25% narrower, which I think is significant still. You're able to, actually, I think that's 30%. Oh, 25, sorry, my math is off. But you have less room there for the weeds to grow and emerge and germinate, and more crop there to compete with them. And it does work. It just, of course, you have to work into the costs and the other logistics of it, but it can work to make the crop more competitive with weeds. As well, sometimes we have to go to tillage, right? So there's mechanical weed control, and sometimes producers will use preceding tillage, especially organic producers. Delays can be used to control our cool season weeds, like I mentioned before. Wild oats being a C3 weed as well that really does well in cool season conditions. Sometimes there's post-seeding tillage that's done. With some, it works well with our deep-seeded crops, just the cotyledons will stay with the seed, and even if we knock something off, the crop will recover. It works quite well with our pulses, pea, lentil, chickpea. Steve Shirtliff at the U of S did quite a fair bit of work and research into row cultivation as well. And I mean, there's a little bit of crop damage no matter what, but it does work pretty well. And it's still, the crops do recover quite well from the stress, but if you've gotten the crop ahead of the weeds, you're really taking away any yield loss there as well from plant or weed competition. So it does work and does do quite well for itself as well. So again, they do make inter-row cultivators. I really don't have much experience with them, but they can be purchased depending on the row spacing that the producer is working on. So I've got a few more topics to cover here, and I think this is one area that there's a little bit more improvement that can be made with harvest weed seed management as well for producers, and it's available for organic and conventional producers. But of course, I did take this from Clark. It's, he always called the combine the great weed spreader, right? Because if we're combining through a field, we can make a kochia patch go from the size of a room to the size of a building quite quickly, or move it from one part of a field to another. So, but of course, we can do something with managing weeds on the combine. So there are chaff decks that are one method that can be used. So they would collect chaff from the sieves on the back of the combine and put it in the wheel tracks. It could work quite well maybe with controlled traffic farming, or to go and burn or till those chaff rows. But I haven't seen a lot of as much of interest or uptake in chaff decks, so much as I've seen a lot more interest and uptake in kind of our cage mills for seed destruction. So this would be like the Harrington Seed Destructor. It's been around for quite a while. It was developed in Australia with a producer. I think his name was around Harrington, or first or last name, a farmer who developed this. Basically, it's a cage mill that the very first model was towed behind a combine, and this is, I'm assuming, like a 21 or 2388 case combine. And all the straw and chaff that went through the combine would go through the cage mill and be just pulverized to a fine dust by some very high-speed rotating parts and components. And then basically you would have no viable weed seeds, or few viable weed seeds coming out the back of the I think they get up to a 99% kill rate or 98% kill rate, which is huge, right? I mean, they're quite a machine to see usually when they're running. In Saskatchewan here we have the Seed Terminator, and it was developed. So I should back up a step. Josh Lade, who farms north of Saskatoon with his in-laws, his cousin Nick Berry did his PhD, and he developed the Seed Terminator. Basically, is the Harrington seed destructor integrated into the back of the combine. Essentially, it's similar to the Redicop model as well that we have. It's an awesome machine. I've been out there multiple times when Josh has been running it, when he's combining. He's got it on 4 of his John Deere combines now, and we're seeing about 30 of these machines, maybe 40 running in Western Canada. Producers have purchased them and are doing their own work and research with them. Downside, they're expensive for an organic farmer. Maybe $150,000 to purchase, and of course to mount on the combine. They run off of a drive belt on the straw chopper, so they integrate quite well. They're not too bad for that. They take about 100 horsepower, 80 to 100 horsepower. So if you're cranking in a hard to thresh crop, or combining to engine power and wheat, could be a problem there. But they're not too bad for cost and maintenance. Josh Lade said about $7 an acre for financing fuel maintenance, so not bad. But it is also one other method that a producer could use, organic or conventional, to control weeds. And also in Australia, given farmers and their ingenuity, they've developed another prototype called the Weed Hog, and that's a model of the C Terminator Harrington weed destructor that can be mounted onto smaller older combines, John Deere 9750 and 8010 case, 8120, whatever you want to call it. Lower horsepower draw, but more like a 60% kill rate, which is still quite good. Just leaving it up to the producer if that makes sense for them to investigate or not. And I'm sure we'll have them available over here, eventually. But I've been out there when Josh has been using them, and it's quite an interesting machine. And this is kind of what the inside looks like. You've got these very fast spinning cage wheels. They spin up to 3,000 RPM. And when you're standing behind the combine and they're winding it up, it's like a jet engine. But that's basically what they are. They spin at a very high RPM in the C Terminator, and they just grind everything to a fine dust there. Now, Brianne Tideman, who was an Ag Canada researcher, who was impacted by the cuts here at Lacombe, but she did a lot of work with the Harrington seed destructor actually, and she had a quick little demo here with canola with no Harrington seed destructor and Harrington seed destructor, and of course she's got a mess of seeds here, right? About 10,000 she figures. With putting crop to the Harrington seed destructor, we've maybe got a couple dozen survivors, and that's a lot easier to deal with, even if we're talking about herbicide resistance being a numbers game. We want to be dealing with that, versus a mat of canola, because or a mat of weeds in general. That's a lot harder and harsher to deal with for a number of issues, especially when we're talking about even competing with the crop and using some moisture and nutrients. So I'll go over a little bit of challenges and a few other things. So of course, with harvest weed seed management, the weeds actually have to go through the combine to be effective. Some highly shattering weeds, like maybe wild oat, we only have maybe 60% still going through at harvest, which is still pretty good. Or the weed can select to grow too short to actually be cut by the combine header, which nature adapts, but it's still worth looking into or trying. As well, some producers will cut above the crop. I've never seen one of these weed surfers moving in action, but I know some guys have gone out with even a swather and raised it really high, maybe above a lentil, and clip weeds off before they can spread seed around. So lots of different methods organic producers can use. So 2 more topics here, and I'll maybe a couple more slides. Organic producers can also use allelopathy, which is the ability of the residue or secretions of one plant to suppress the growth and germination of another. Research and studies have found that green manuring residues of rye, sweet clover, and even Sudan grass can help suppress weeds the following year. So this is some work on allelopathy, showing some results. So on the left here, we have the effect of sweet clover residue on dandelion density the following spring. Different methods here, whether it's dist or cultivated or hayed or mowed. So we have no sweet clover and sweet clover. The main thing there is just to show with the allelopathy from the sweet clover, it significantly did reduce the stand of the density of the dandelion. Slickweed, very similar results, right? Even though maybe some treatments were better than others for how they reduced their stand. The sweet clover alone did quite a fair number to just reduce the the density of the weeds. And of course, kochia, our problem weed that we've been dealing with here, especially in the dry conditions. Again, with that sweet clover allelopathy, really took down the kochia stand density to almost nothing the following year. So another method that an organic producer can use or think about how they can manage weeds on their farm. And my last topic is just going to be biocontrol. This can also work. It might be for certain species or certain situations, but it's using a weed's natural predators to suppress its growth. You can have classical biocontrol, which is using an insect or a disease from a weed's place of origin, so it would be self-sustaining because some insects or diseases do thrive or self-sustain off of that weed. We can also have inundative biocontrol, which would be using a local pathogen at a very high volume to induce a disease and maybe control or suppress that weed. There's also grazing sometimes can work as well because different species will prefer a broader range of forage, including the weed. Some livestock, such as goats or sheep, are able to graze on some weeds that maybe a horse or a cow isn't. Then can maybe, like, I think it's leafy spurge and a few other, depending on the species, some livestock are also able to graze, which can also be a way to manage weeds in a pasture as well. So that's pretty much my talk for the half hour or so. Of course, I've got my contact info there, cell phone and email, and I'll take any questions or try to deal with them if anyone has any burning questions around the topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, Corey. We have a few questions here, so we can go through those, and if any more come in, throw them at you too.
Sure.
So the first question we have is, does organic land always require a buffer zone from the road allowance?
I wouldn't say it always requires a buffer. I would say it's more care and attention. Because I mean, you can spray right up to it if you want to. It just, can you do it carefully so you're not drifting onto their field?
Okay. And then the second question we have is, what do you do if an organic producer doesn't do anything regarding the weeds on his property?
You know, if you're the weed inspector that's been appointed, I would put some work and effort in to go and see that producer and try to get an agreement up with them to control the weeds and work on that. And I think it's about relationships as well. I know that's really hard because they do take time, but seeing if they can work with them and do something about it, give them a few chances and have some written documentation saying, hey, I visited you on this day. You said you were going to do something, you didn't. And if you have some proof and you give them what you consider to be a fair amount of chances and you become fed up, I think you can move towards an order or go to herbicides. But I would use that as a very much a last resort after you've had some multiple attempts to make some headways with that producer, so you can at least tell the RM, or if it escalates, that, hey, we gave you trouble, but you're not exempt from the Weed Control Act. You still have to control your weeds. And we gave you multiple chances. You did nothing. Now it's escalated to where we're going to do something for you. But I would really try to find a line there to give them lots of opportunity before action is taken.
Okay. We just had one come in here. I'm just looking over.
Sure.
Okay, so then when spraying a road allowance, there is no required buffered from the organic land?
I don't think there's a required buffer. I would just use care and attention with it. Yeah, I mean, if you want to use a buffer, you can, but there's nothing in the act stating you have to stay 5 feet away. Now, if you're going to spray, say worst case scenario, and he has a prohibited weed and you have to spray his field, I would maybe then create a buffer in the field so he doesn't lose the whole field certification. He might only lose, let's say, a couple 100 feet. Then you might create a buffer there just to make sure we're not getting any drift or any mixing of sprayed grain being mixed in with the organic. That's how I understand it.
Okay. So can an order be submitted for an entire field to be cultivated or mowed, whether it's fallow or has crop on it?
I believe so, as long as the entire field is infested with the weed of issue or weeds of issue.
Okay. Oh, I guess I don't know. Okay. Are producers required to sign and notify the RM that parcels of their land are organic?
I think they're. I'm not sure if they're required, but like I covered at the beginning, I think through the certifying body that the RM is let know about it, and that's more of the courtesy, so we don't have issues with someone drifting if they're spraying a ditch or your neighbor beside you accidentally drifting on your crop and causing some damage.
Okay. Just waiting to see if any more questions come in.
Sure, sure. Well, people can always email me too. Like I say, if you're curious, you know, to be honest, I'm still learning a lot in the role. I mean, it's big shoes to fill, and I need a few more years to get, well, quite a while to get to Clark's level, but it's slowly getting better and better. I'll put it that way.
Okay.
Just one thing on buffer zones. Sorry, everybody, this is Kate Kohaniuk. I'm just lurking in the background here. On organic buffer zones, a lot of organic farmers use road allowances as buffer zones, just so they gain a little bit of land that way. They use their own. But legally, they're responsible for their own buffer zones. So they can't technically use the ditches as buffer zones, but lots of them do. A lot of RMs don't spray, so they're able to gain a little bit of land that way technically. Yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Okay. I don't see any more questions. Oh, hold on. Is there any plans to update the regulations to increase the dollar amount that an RM can charge per acres for controlling weeds, charge the taxes?
Not in the immediate short term, but it has been brought up. It would have to involve going back into reopening the act, and I don't have any reasoning why it wasn't done in the first place, because Clark did open that, and we really just closed it here back 6 months ago in July. Wow, a little bit before that.
Okay. Okay, I'm not seeing any more right at the moment, but we'll wait a second. Okay, I'm not seeing any, so unless some come in here right as I'm speaking, I think we can call that a wrap. Okay. Once again, thank you very much for your time, Corey, and the wonderful presentation.
Happy to do it. Thanks very much, Mary-Eve and Katie and all attendees, and I'm sure I'll be seeing everybody shortly again.
Okay.
Have a great day there.
You.